Anton earned his PhD in 2019 at Johns Hopkins University. And his dissertation was on Hegel's philosophy of nature, and now is working as research assistant at University of Potsdam. Today's presentation is Hegel and Spinoza on determinacy and negation. Thank you, Anton.
Thank you. And thanks for organizing this conference. I would like to thank the organizers. It's really wonderful. So my talk focuses on the remark in the second edition of The Logic of Being at the beginning of the second chapter, Das Dasein, where Hegel attacks the concept of God as omnitudo realitatis, or Inbegriff aller Realitäten. In the same remark, he affirms the importance of Spinoza's dictum determinatio negatio est, and provides some critical discussion of Spinoza's metaphysics. In the first edition, it's actually these topics are split into separate remarks. These are all aspects of Hegel's attack on the view, in my view, it's all aspects of Hegel's attack of the view that reality is both ontologically and conceptually prior to negation, the view that a multitude of philosophers from at least Parmenides onwards have held to be obviously correct, and that comes in a variety of forms. Hegel's critique of this family of views can be seen as an important thread throughout the logic of being, and to some extent his logic in general. Thus, for example, in the first chapter of this of the logic of being, in the Dasein, Hegel attacks the simplest version of this view to the effect that the fundamental reality that does not involve any limitation or negation is something simple and undifferentiated. Basically, the Parmenidean view. In the second chapter, Das Dasein, in the remark mentioned, the target of his attack is the view that the fundamental reality, or God, does not involve any limitation or negation, and yet has or is constituted by multiple predicates or attributes. This view was quite widespread among early modern philosophers, up until to and including Kant, who developed two versions of this view. The metaphysical one in the only possible argument, and the critical version of it in the chapter on the transcendental ideal of the critique of pure reason. Now, on the relatively standard, so-called objectivist reading of Spinoza's attributes, this is also Spinoza's view. And in this paper, I will try to outline the dialectical situation between Spinoza and as well as other representatives of this view of God as omnitudo realitatis on the one hand, and Hegel on the other hand, on this particular issue. I start with looking at Hegel's objection to this view in the remark mentioned above. Then I will consider Spinoza's possible response to this objection, which might actually clarify some obscurity in his definition of the attribute. And finally, I will point out where Hegelian reasons for nevertheless rejecting this Spinoza's position in spite of this possible response might lie. Okay, the first part, the remarks, so the somewhat closer reading of this remark now. So Hegel's argument in the section before the remark was supposed to establish the determinacy as such, or Bestimmtheit, which at this point he names quality, has two aspects to it, namely reality and negation. So the ontological implication of this point could be understood in such a way that for anything to be determinate, it is essential both that it is something in its own right and that it negates or excludes other things. This negation is constitutive of its determinacy just as much as its reality is. So there is no priority of reality over this negation. At the end of that section, just before the remark, Hegel points out that when one considers determinate being or Dasein as reality, its negative aspect is concealed, which can lead one to consider reality as something merely positive, from which negation, quote, from which negation of verneinung, boundedness, lack are excluded, unquote. So as I have just indicated in the introduction, I believe that this sort of prioritization of reality over negation is a mistake that Hegel deals with throughout at least the logic of being in its various forms, from the initial transitions from the pure being to nothing and to becoming, to the discussion of the absolute indifference at the end of the book. The significance of this mistake is related to the fact that so many significant philosophers have made it, and it is no wonder that at this point Hegel devotes a lengthy remark largely to the comments on this topic. In the remark, after some comments on various senses of the word reality, Hegel turns to the concept of God as Inbegriff aller Realitäten, or sum total of all reality. As he points out, this concept is related to the ontological proof of God's existence, although at this point he actually only outlines the preliminary step of this argument that Leibniz specifically supplied, namely the proof that the concept of God is not contradictory since it contains only purely positive predicates that contain no negation, and so the conjunction of such predicates cannot contain a contradiction. Now, Hegel's problem here is not so much with this reasoning that, the conjunction of realities which don't include negation involves no contradiction, but with the underlying concept of a purely positive reality that does not contain any negation or limitation. As we have seen, he takes himself to have already established in the main text before the remark that any determinate being contains negation as its aspect. Because of this, a purely positive predicate would be nothing determinate, and thus would in fact coincide with the first category that Hegel considers in the logic, or the indeterminate pure being. And now a somewhat lengthier quote on this point. Hegel says, bei diesem Begriffe der Realität wird angenommen, dass sie dann noch bleibe, wenn alle Negationen weggedacht werden. Damit wird aber alle Bestimmtheit derselben aufgehoben. Die Realität ist Qualität Dasein. Damit enthält sie das Moment des Negativen und ist allein dadurch das Bestimmte, das sie ist. Im sogenannten eminenten Sinne oder als unähnliche, in der gewöhnlichen Bedeutung des Wortes, wie sie genommen werden soll, wird sie in die Bestimmungslose erweitert und verliert ihre Bedeutung. Okay, so this indeterminateness and the resulting meaninglessness of positive predicates implies that the concept of God as the sum total of all realities is itself something indeterminate and empty, and thus also collapses back into this Parmenidean concept of undifferentiated being. As Hegel expresses it, Gott als das rein Reale in allem Realen oder als Inbegriff aller Realitäten ist dasselbe Bestimmungs- und Gehaltlose, was das leere Absolute, in dem alles eins ist. Now, of course, the philosophers who adopted this concept have meant it so that God has multiple different predicates, each of which expresses only reality and no negation. Indeed, in the case of Spinoza, on the standard reading of what infinity of attributes means, God has infinitely many attributes. There is an alternative view that infinite here means only all, so it's compatible with there being just two. But on the standard reading for Spinoza, there are infinitely many attributes, each of which is purely positive, so that doesn't contain negation. So Hegel's point here must be that such philosophers are not entitled to assuming that there could be multiple different purely positive predicates, because for them to be distinct from each other, their natures would have to involve negation of each other. If, however, each supposedly purely positive predicate is completely indeterminate, then they cannot differ from each other, and so God cannot have multiple purely positive predicates. That's a kind of summary of his argument in this remark against this view of God as in Begriff aller Realitäten. And now if we consider Spinoza as a representative of this view, which is possible under this so-called objective interpretation of his attributes, according to which attributes are really and really distinct from each other. So on this view, we can see that in Spinoza's text, there are actually, this problem sort of manifests in a couple of places. So one place where we can see maybe a problem with Spinoza's view that there are multiple such attributes is at the very beginning of part 2 of the Ethics, where he tries to prove that that thought and extension are attributes of God. So he provides a proof. So I don't have quotes here, but basically the argument is that for thought, the modes of thought are, because their modes must be conceived through God, and then by reference to the definition of modes, he concludes that they have to be conceived under some attribute of God, which, okay, is, I guess, fine for us here. And then he says, okay, I named this predicate, this attribute extension, which is also fine. And then he says, well, the same goes for the next for the attribute of extension. So that was for thought. The same goes for extension. But the thing is that the problem is that he doesn't prove that they are distinct from each other. In fact, yeah. So the arguments that the modes of thought can be conceived through some attribute of God, and the modes of extension can be conceived through some attribute of God. Must be supplemented by a proof that these attributes are actually also distinct, in order to, at this point, to show that, there are two distinct attributes of God. So we see that, actually, Spinoza doesn't really prove that there are two different attributes of God. Another point where we can see sort of this problem with the plurality, well, in this case, maybe not directly with the plurality of the attributes, but with this notion that they don't involve negation in Spinoza, is actually his definition 6 of part 1 of the Ethics, where Spinoza seems to characterize attributes both as involving no negation and as something of which we can negate infinite attributes, right? As actually Isaac Melamed also notes in some places. Now one can make this consistent by suggesting that an attribute does not involve negation only within its own kind, since it is infinite in its own kind. For example, the attribute of extension does not involve any negations or limitations within extension, which is not to say that one cannot deny thought and other attributes of it. But this would mean that attributes do involve negation insofar as they exclude other attributes, and this negation in part makes them the attributes that they are. Now Hegel at least entertains this interpretative option, so this reading of Spinoza, later in the same remark when he's discussing Spinoza's formula determination as negation. There he initially suggests that thought and extension, insofar as they are determinate realities, are negations, presumably, of each other and of other attributes. On this reading, they would be determinate aspects, or in Hegel's terminology, as he says, they're moments of the one substance. So it's a possible reading, but Hegel himself quickly abandons this interpretative option and asserts that vielmehr sind sie ihm nicht einmal Momente, denn die Substanz ist das inner Selbst ganz bestimmungslose und die Attribute sind, wie auch die Modi, Unterscheidungen, die ein äußerer Verstand macht. In this quote, the reference to the external intellect can be read in two ways. In one way, it can be as a reference to Spinoza's definition of the attribute at definition 4 of part 1, to which I will return quickly, and to Hegel's own distinction between the immanent development of the logical. The second way is as a reference to Hegel's own distinction between the immanent development of the logical categories out of each other on the one hand, and the merely external reflection upon those categories and their relation on the other. So if we read the reference in the first way, we effectively ascribe the ecosmist interpretation of Spinoza to Hegel. The second meaning of this external intellect as this sort of external reflection seems to be operative actually in Hegel's later critique of Spinoza towards the end of the Logic of Essence, where his primary objection seems to be that even though Spinoza does posit attributes and modes of the one substance, he does not develop these further determinations immanently, but just posits them. But in any case, this further critique of Spinoza is not particularly relevant to our topic here. And as far as the ecosmist interpretation goes, the aspect of it that is important for us now is not the modi, right? Whether they are objective in Spinoza or just shine. But Hegel's argument that if Spinoza conceives of attributes as something that does not offer any negation at all, which is like contrary to this interpretative option which he himself entertains but abandons, so Spinoza cannot maintain the plurality of the attributes. And as I have already pointed out, this objection affects many other early modern philosophers as well. Okay, that's the first part, Hegel's critique of Spinoza in this remark. Now, question, could Spinoza and other philosophers who endorsed the concept of God as omnitude or Realitäten respond to this objection in some satisfactory way? So this is more of a philosophical part, I guess, less textual, a little bit textual. Well, one option is to accept the option that Hegel entertains in this remark, namely to accept the point that attributes are indeed partially constituted by negation, but only of all other attributes, and thus are not purely positive after all. So they are infinite in their own kinds. They are not, so for example, the attribute of extension does not involve any negation within extension, but it does involve negation of other attributes of God, and so for all other attributes. So as far as Spinoza is concerned, I think there's evidence both for and against this interpretative option. But what I see as a central difficulty for this view is that since according to definition 4 of part 1, the attributes constitute God's essence, if the attributes were to involve negation, then so would God, which is, I think, contrary to Spinoza's some very basic positions. Hegel actually still never entertains this idea in the same remark, and here's a quote. He says, "Wird dagegen die Realität in ihrer Bestimmtheit genommen, so wird, da sie wesentlich das Moment des Negativen enthält, der Inbegriff aller Realitäten ebenso sehr zu einem Inbegriff aller Negationen, dem Inbegriff aller Widersprüche, zunächst etwa zur absoluten Macht, in der alles Bestimmte absorbiert ist, aber da sie selbst nur ist, insofern sie noch ein von ihr nicht aufgehobenes sich gegenüber hat, so wird sie, indem sie zur ausgeführten schrankenlosen Macht erweitert gedacht wird, zum abstrakten Nichts." So I think it's might be some anticipation of some of his considerations in the Logic of Essence. So this sort of goes also beyond the topic of this paper. As well as the thorough assessment of the evidence for and against of this interpretation as an interpretation of Spinoza. And as far as other early modern philosophers, such as, for example, Leibniz, Wolff, and Kant, they seem to be clearly accepting the doctrine of multiple purely positive predicates. So this option, as far as I see, is not even open to them. Okay, so any other way to respond to Hegel here? Well, another option might be this. One can say that there are multiple attributes or predicates which express some but not all of reality, and that they differ from each other. And here the thought would be these differences are not constitutive of these attributes. But then one can ask, okay, so what would be the reason for the attributes' difference from each other in this kind of case? And also, as far as I can see, the only possible answer seems to be that they would have to differ from each other in virtue of their own determinate positive nature alone, or in virtue of what they are in themselves. And this means that the attributes would have their own intrinsic nature on the one hand, and their difference from other attributes on the other, and also the former, so their own intrinsic nature, would one-sidedly determine the latter without being in any way sort of touched by this difference of the attributes from other attributes. For example, the attributes of extension and thought would each have their own determinate positive natures, let's say A and B respectively, and A would be different from B, but the determinacy of the natures A and B would not be dependent on their difference from each other, or on their difference from any other attributes. And this difference between extension and thought would then in no way be reflected in their natures A and B, although it would be something that an intellect that considers that both of them would register. Now, is this a view that Spinoza himself endorsed or could have endorsed? Well, I think it might actually be that his famously strange and contentious definition of the attribute at definition 4 of part 1 is actually an indication, a possible indication of him endorsing this view. So the definition says, by attribute I understand what the intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. And the question is, why does Spinoza mention the intellect at all in this definition? Right, and this is a question on which Spinoza's scholars have been divided for a long time. Those who favor the so-called subjective interpretation of the attributes suggest that Spinoza mentions the intellect because the attributes do not really constitute the essence of the substance, but do so only apparently or for the intellect. These interpreters can make sense of Spinoza's reference to the intellect here, but the reading faces many other problems, not going to list them. By contrast, the proponents of the objective interpretation of the attributes argue that the attributes are really distinct from each other, and really do constitute the essence of the substance, but they have difficulty explaining why he mentions the intellect in this definition. And what I suggest here is that our considerations about the question of whether negation enters into the nature of the attributes can help objectivists to explain this reference. Maybe Spinoza was himself concerned with this issue, and that this is not an anachronistic reading of Hegelian considerations back into Spinoza might be indicated by him seeming vacillation in the definition 6 of part 1. And maybe he at least entertained the response along these lines, the lines proposed above, although maybe not, he didn't fully work it out and didn't say it in so many words. So the thought would then be that attributes do indeed constitute the essence of a substance, but only an external intellect can perceive the difference between these attributes. So they differ, but only, that is not reflected in their natures, and only external intellect can register that difference. And so also the multitude of the attributes. And okay, that's the second part, and the short third part is whether there are Hegelian arguments against this position. So there are a couple of places in the logic of being which might seem promising. One is Hegel's discussion of determination, or Bestimmung, which stands for the intrinsic nature of something, or etwas, and constitution, or Beschaffenheit, which stands for the side with which it is open to other things. Hegel argues that although these aspects of something are indeed different from each other, and they initially seem to be indifferent, or gleichgültig towards each other, a closer look shows that they are not. Rather, insofar as that which something is in itself is also at it is afflicted with being for other. The determination as such is thus open to the relation to another. Now, the case with attributes whose intrinsic nature does not involve its difference from other attributes seems to exactly fit this kind of case, right? It's sort of its intrinsic nature is initially seem to be indifferent to their relation to other attributes. So if Hegel's argument against this position is successful, then it's also telling against the Spinozist position that I constructed here. Then there is a similar place, I just mentioned it, where Hegel talks about Ansich sein and sein für anderes, which are sort of previous versions of this Bestimmung, Beschaffenheit pair. Also kind of have very similar remarks on this. And the third place is his transition from the initial discussion of something and other, or etwas und ein anderes. Just a bit. Initially, there is a full symmetry between the something and the other, in that both are something and both are other with respect to another. And so the designation of either something as other is arbitrary in this way, and so it's something external to it. Again, this is the position which is seems similar to the situation with attributes. If they're excluding of each other, negating each other, does not enter into their constitution, then calling them sort of different from other attributes is just an extrinsic denomination of them, something that is sort of not intrinsic to them. Again, Hegel has some reasons to make a transition from that to the next position, where to the discussion of the other of itself and not just the other of the other something. So the problems with all these transitions in Hegel, I don't think that any of the transitions would constitute something like a knockdown argument for a Spinozist, without also looking at the whole way as how Hegel even arrives to this constitution of something as something, because by the time he arrives at something, he already has this view that something is, includes negation in the structure. If he just starts from here, yeah, Spinoza, of course, would not buy it, or any other philosopher like that. So a proper way to argue here against the Spinozist would be to start with the beginning of the logic and reconstruct the whole line of thought. But just to close, I think there's also a bit of a less sort of intrinsic, another argument, maybe a bit ad hominem argument against Spinoza here, or against also Leibniz and Wolff, for example. Philosophers who all accepted the principle of sufficient reason in a strong form. The response had to, that response, Spinozist response, which I considered in the second part, had to assume both the existence of determinacy as such and the determinacy of each of the attributes as something that is not further explicable, just as a brute fact. And any adherent of the principle of sufficient reason should not be content with accepting brute facts, and especially so many brute facts, in Spinoza's case, an infinity of brute facts for each attribute. So, and on the other hand, Hegel has an account of determinacy in general, of what explains for the existence of determinacy, right? In terms of a structure that involves both negation and reality. And he would also have an account of any specific difference in terms of exclusion of other things. So there, in this way, I think he also has an ad hominem argument against philosophers who both accept the omnitude Realitatis doctrine and the principle of sufficient reason. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes for our discussion.
Mr. Kabeshkin, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I have a question more, maybe clarification. How you exactly conceive of the relationship between determinacy, or determinatedness as you put it, and negation. Because in your elaborations you focused very much on this negation being a relationship to something else. For example, this first option you gave with the attributes, so they have no negation in themselves, but they have a negative relationship to something else. And then, of course, you have this in Hegel, etwas und anderes, and all these kind of things, and they're fully right. But wouldn't the first approach not be to say that determinacy is itself a negation? So that this whole, we don't need this relationship in first instance, something else. It is just determination is itself negation. And then if that is the case, then certain options you now sketched, I would say that drop. And what remains at least is what you also mentioned, namely that if you really want to get rid of this Hegelian argument, you have to destroy the beginning of the logic. And if you're not capable of doing that, it's over. Because the fact that the determinacy is itself negation is already, so to say, an implication of this beginning. And so my question is therefore, do you not focus too much, or at least now in your talk, on negation as relationship to something else, but not determination itself as negation?
Well, that's right. Yeah, the determination is negation, but it's, well, one can understand it as a negation of something else. Of course, Spinoza, Hegel has also a further concept of self-negation, right, or negation of negation. That's a further concept which I didn't focus on, that's right, because I was focusing more on the sort of dialectical relation between Spinoza and Hegel. Yeah, if you explicate Hegel's own position, then that's not everything to it, so to say. Yeah, that's the more important, maybe even the more important thing, yes, is this self-negation. I sort of alluded to it at the end, this transition to this andere seiner selbst. Yeah, but yeah, that was just not in sort of the focus of the paper, because I was focusing on this, whether Hegel has some argument against Spinoza here. And I think, yeah, there are some, he can create some serious problems for Spinoza or similar philosophers here. Mm-hmm.
I think you are pressing Spinoza in really super interesting places. That's really some of the places that. So 2 quick points. I mean, one is with regard to the infinitely many brute facts. So, you know, Spinoza's first answer, which I think is right, I mean, would be to say, no, they're not brute facts, they're self-conceived, right? I mean, by definition, an attribute is self-conceived. So it's not primitive, it's not unconceived, it's not unexplainable, it is self-explainable. Now, of course, you can and should keep on pressing him, or I will press him and say, well, what's precisely, how do you spell out the difference between primitive and self-explanatory? And I think there is a good question here. I'm not sure actually that either side is going to win on this issue. The second point is when you ask, when you press this question about what distinguishes two attributes from each other, I think that Spinoza is definitely going to say it must be attributes must be self-explanatory, right? Self-conceived, self-explanatory, identity, non-identity, all must be built into the concept of this specific attribute. Now, if Spinoza is also able to work out, and I think he does, able to work out the proof that each attribute have nothing in common with the other, so it seems that once you have something as being designated as an attribute, I mean, it cannot, nothing about it can be explained by an appeal to something else. All this being said, I think you can still and should press Spinoza on the beginning of part 2, right? So the argument is saying, now, how does your proof of the second attribute, the first attribute is always easy, how does your proof of the second attribute is going to work? I mean, I think it's an excellent question.
I mean, I think I took it from you initially, but thanks. I mean, yeah, so as far as self-explanatory, attributes being self-explanatory, well, yeah, he would say that, but here the idea is that, well, if he, I guess also there, it's not just that, like, is everything about attributes sort of self-explanatory? Then is there, I mean, the question here is specifically about the determinacy, like being not just some attribute, but this determinate attribute. Yeah, I mean, I guess my question would be like, okay, what exactly does it mean that, for example, an attribute of extension is self-explanatory, right, as opposed to just being a brute fact that it has this specificity of being an attribute of extension. I mean, yeah, there's I guess I would just, as you sort of suggest, also would try to push it further, maybe spell it out a little bit. Yeah, the second point. Yeah, I think the argument that attributes do not have anything in common with each other, it comes kind of later, right? That, and what I'm concerned with here is sort of the initial assumptions. So if we can put pressure on the assumptions, sort of at the level of like definitions, then it's not clear that he can build this argument about them having nothing in common on that foundation if the foundation itself is problematic. So that's sort of the idea here.
There are no other questions. So thank you.